and after a few seconds we simultaneously pulled the trigger. After that, the Polish sniper went silent. We must have killed or badly wounded him. I began to scout for a new target and saw flashes in one of the windows, periodically appearing at the end of the machine gun barrel. The machine gunners were not visible to me, and I fired several shots, orienting myself to the flashes. This brought no result. The machine gun must have been mounted at an angle to the window opening, and the machine gunners were somewhere off to the side. I fired several shots, aiming a little to the left and a little to the right of the flashes at the end of the machine gun barrel. However, the result was still 0. I didn't understand how this could have happened. And suddenly, in another gust of wind, the smoke opposite this window cleared for a few moments, and I saw that the machine gun was actually set up at an angle to the window opening, and the machine gunners were ensconced behind a pile of sacks that were probably filled with sand. Well, in this case, it was only natural that my bullets would get stuck in these sacks without harming the poles. I quickly put aside my sniper rifle and picked up my anti-tank rifle. It did not have a telescopic sight, and I was not at all sure that I would hit with it from such a distance. Nevertheless, I had to try my luck. I took careful aim where the machine gunner would be behind the sandbags and pulled the trigger. I felt as if I had been struck on the shoulder by a horse's hoof, for the recoil of the anti-tank gun was so strong. My ears were ringing. However, the enemy machine gun was silent, and that was the most important thing. I kept looking for targets in the windows, and the other snipers did the same. The ordinary infantrymen and machine gunners also did not stop firing at the school. And soon I realized that there were no poles left in the windows of the side of the building facing us. I expected our infantry to storm the building, but it didn't happen. After waiting for a few minutes, I decided to find out what was going on. I turned to Felix. "Felix, you and your guys can cover me while I jump up to the house opposite the school where ours are positioned. They're not storming it for some reason. We need to find out what's going on there." "Come on, we'll cover," Felix agreed. I left him my anti-tank rifle and ran to the 2-story building that stood 100 meters away from us, right in front of the school. "Don't shoot! I'm mine!" I shouted, running into the entrance. "Come in if you belong," I heard a cheerful voice from the apartment on the first floor. Once there, I saw 5 riflemen and 2 machine gunners. "We must storm the building before the Poles get reinforcements," I blurted out. "Are there any other fighters here besides you?" "Our sergeant is in the next building," I was told. "There are also several other platoons nearby." Together with one of the soldiers, I immediately rushed to the neighbouring building, in the entrance of which I almost ran into the sergeant in a hurry. He was a man of about 40, with the appearance of an experienced and judicious German soldier. I explained to him at once that I was a sniper and that together with other snipers we had definitely made sure that there were no Poles left on the outside of the school building defending it. "Now is the time for an assault," I insisted. "Wait," the sergeant answered me. "I can't throw my guys in there without an order from above. Perhaps we can talk to Captain Biedenbach." When I heard those words, I was embarrassed. I myself was only a lieutenant, and the captain was supposed to command the whole company. So I mumbled, "Well, I guess the captain can handle it without us. Perhaps we shouldn't bother him." I turned to leave. "Wait, kid." The sergeant stopped me. "I think you said a good thing, but it really needs to be discussed with the captain." Together with the sergeant, we went out the back door of the house and rushed toward a large group of soldiers standing a few houses behind us. The sergeant led me over to one of the soldiers, who was dressed in exactly the same uniform as the other soldiers, but he was wearing the captain's insignia. "What's wrong, Sergeant?" the captain asked, looking at my companion. "I brought you a sniper from another unit. He claims that there are no Poles left on this side of the school building, which means we can take it by storm." The captain gave me an appraising look. "What's your name, Sergeant?" he asked. I stretched out as I was supposed to do in front of an officer, but I did not salute as was the Wehrmacht custom. "Gunther Bauer, Mr. Captain." "Why didn't you salute me as you should have, Sergeant Bauer?" I did not want the enemy snipers, if there are any nearby, could understand that you are an officer, Herr Kapitän, I said. Captain Biedenbach looked around nervously, but then smiled. It's all right. You did the right thing, Efloithor. He glanced at my rifle with a telescopic sight. Are you really a sniper? Yes, sir, Mr. Captain. Well, let's get closer and look at the damn school together. The captain, accompanied by the soldiers, walked forward. No sooner had we taken a few steps than a machine gunner on the top floor of a building, about 200 meters away from us, opened fire on us. A few seconds later, 4 soldiers from the captain's escort collapsed to the ground and screamed in pain. They were wounded. Everyone else, including the captain, immediately fell to the ground so as not to become too easy a target for the enemy machine gunner. And I immediately set up my rifle in a firing position and aimed my crosshairs at the Polish machine gunner. Not a minute later, my bullets destroyed both the machine gunner who was firing at us and his partner. Well done, Sergeant Bauer, Captain Biedenbach patted me on the shoulder. Thank you for the praise, Mr. Captain, I replied, still looking around warily. It was finally clear to me that I could not relax. Meanwhile, the captain looked at the patches on my uniform. It was obvious from them what division I was from. Your division participated in the heavy fighting at the capture of Kalitz? He asked me. That's right, Mr. Captain. How many Poles have you killed so far? I was confused. I myself tried to think less about how many people I had killed, but nevertheless I knew a rough figure. About 30, Mr. Captain. The other soldiers standing nearby looked at me sceptically. However, there was no doubt in Captain Biedenbach's gaze. You must stay near me. That's an order, Sergeant Bauer, he said. Yes, Mr. Captain, I replied. Soon we reached the house that was directly opposite the school. However, now the school building was again occupied by machine gunners and Polish gunners who were firing in our direction. Damn it, we have to clear the building of them again, I burst out. Calm down, Sergeant. The captain once again patted me on the shoulder. I have another plan. He turned to the lieutenant who was accompanying him. Take 3 platoons and search the neighborhood. We need to find as many Polish anti-tank guns and their ammunition as possible. All this should be pulled here. The captain pointed to the area behind the house we were in. As soon as it's done, report to me. Yes, Mr. Captain. The lieutenant hurried out of the house, accompanied by 2 soldiers. Captain Biedenbach turned to me. Lieutenant Bauer, do you see how old the school building is? Yes, Mr. Captain, I answered. And what did you do before you were drafted? This question seemed unexpected to me, and I blurted out, I worked in my mother's bakery, Mr. Captain. Perhaps that should have been said a little differently. At any rate, after I said it, several of the men laughed, and even Captain Biedenbach himself couldn't help smiling. I was an architect before the army, he said, and I know this type of building. At first glance they seem very strong, but everything in them is held together by the brick walls of the box, and if we collapse even one wall, the whole building will be in ruins. He walked over to a wooden table in the kitchen of the apartment we were in. Taking out his bayonet knife, Captain Biedenbach scratched a rectangle right on the table. Here is the school building, and we are here. He scratched another rectangle, marking the house we were in. I need you, Sergeant Bauer, and a few other snipers to position yourself here and here. The captain scratched 2 more squares, marking neighbouring buildings. Can you hit the poles from here? Yes, Mr. Captain, I answered. The distance from the buildings chosen by the captain to the school was a little more than 200 meters, and I could be sure that from such a distance not only I, but also the other snipers were unlikely to miss. Sergeant, bring the 10 best snipers here, the captain commanded. Then he turned to me. You will be in charge of the snipers during the assault. The sergeant returned with the snipers about 10 minutes later. To my delight, Felix was among them. He immediately handed me the anti-tank gun I had left with him. Well, now you are our commander. Felix looked at me with surprise and admiration. However, I myself was not too comfortable. I was very afraid that the slightest of my mistakes would lead to the death of some of the snipers. I explained to them how and where to set up in 2 buildings near the school. Since the captain had chosen 2 buildings, we were to split into 2 groups. One of them was led by myself, and the leadership of the second was entrusted to Felix. During our short acquaintance with him, I had become convinced that he was quite suitable for this role. Before we occupied the buildings intended for us, I had time to see how the infantrymen dragged 3 Polish anti-tank guns to their destination. They looked to me very much like the German 37mm guns used by the Wehrmacht. Soon a sergeant came up to me. "The captain ordered the snipers to start taking out the school's defenders," he said. "That's right, Sergeant," I replied. Only a few minutes passed, and we occupied the buildings chosen by the captain. "Men kill every Pole you see in the window of the school, but above all the machine gunners and snipers, if they are there," I commanded. After that, I fixed my telescopic sight. I killed 2 enemy machine gunners and noted with satisfaction that the other snipers had done their job just as well. Moreover, one of the Polish gunners was hit by 2 snipers at the same time right before my eyes. There were fewer and fewer defenders of the school left. Meanwhile, I saw that our soldiers had already set up the captured Polish guns just opposite the school building. They opened fire on the brick wall. The number of Poles who were returning fire from the windows increased somewhat, but I and other snipers immediately silenced most of them, and the guns continued to fire on the school, and already the school was shrouded in white smoke. The guns were firing mostly on the first floor, and after about their 30th volley, the entire west wall of the building facing us suddenly shuddered and collapsed. The south wall began to collapse as well. "It's incredible," I exclaimed. "And I always knew that our captain is very smart," said one of the snipers. "The main thing is that he takes care of his men," I said, and then we saw a white flag flying in a window on the north side of the school. Several Polish soldiers came out of the building with their arms raised. They were surrendering. In about 3 hours, the whole town of Kutno was taken. Shortly thereafter, I was told the location of my platoon and was able to return there. The sergeant was already aware that I had not deserted, but was fighting together with another unit, so I didn't have any problems. "What happened to you, Gunther?" asked me Anton, who knew nothing about where I was during the storming of the city. I briefly told him about how I dragged a wounded man, how I could not find my unit, and how we stormed the school. Michael came up to us. The 2 of them and Anton told me about how they stormed the buildings themselves, and that several other guys from our platoon had died. I felt sorry for those guys, but somehow I was awfully glad that Michael and Anton were unharmed. We continued to discuss the battle for the city. Suddenly we were interrupted by Sergeant Berger. He called out to me, "Sergeant Bauer!" "I'm listening to you, Sergeant." "Gunther, you are taken to another division," he said. "What?" I interrogated, not immediately realized the meaning of his words. "Here is the order of your transfer to the 3rd Infantry Division." The sergeant handed me a yellow piece of paper. It was hard for me to say goodbye to Anton, Michael, and Sergeant Berger. Nevertheless, I had to rush to the new division and report my arrival to the company commander himself. As you might expect, it turned out to be Captain Biedenbach. I saluted him in full uniform. "Lieutenant Bauer has arrived at your command." "At ease, Sergeant," he replied. "I apologize if this transfer was too sudden for you, but I could not allow such a talented sniper to be under another commander. I give you my word, Gunther, you will not regret it." "Thank you for your trust, Mr. Captain," I replied, amazed that the officer called me by name. Usually officers called privates, officers and even sergeants only by their last names. They treated us almost like slaves. Captain Biedenbach, however, was clearly not one of those commanders. "To justify your transfer, I had to report to the colonel that you are an extremely capable sniper." The captain smiled. "He wanted you to report to him in person tomorrow morning. I was completely embarrassed by this attention to my person. My confusion must have been written all over my face. Captain Biedenbach patted me on the shoulder with a familiar gesture. "Do not worry, Gunther. In this is nothing special. Our colonel tries to know by sight his best fighters, and if you continue to fight as in today's battle, I think you will still have to show his face." "I will try to fight no worse, Mr. Captain," I replied, still not fully recovered from the embarrassment. "Good, Gunther. Now go to your new platoon. You deserve a rest." I reported my arrival to the sergeant in charge of the platoon. Among my new co-workers, I saw some of the guys I had commanded during the capture of the Polish school. I felt embarrassed in front of them. Most of them, like me, were non-commissioned officers. In battle, however, as a rule, only someone who was considerably older than them could command soldiers of the same rank as him. However, I was probably the youngest of my new comrades. I immediately began to apologize to them that circumstances were such that I had to be their commander. "Nonsense, don't apologize for that," said one of them. "You were a good commander. None of us were killed or even wounded under your command. Besides, you are a very good shot yourself. We are glad that now you are in our platoon, Gunther." After that, the speaker looked at the anti-tank gun on my shoulder and asked, "What kind of gun is this?" "An anti-tank gun," I answered, taking it off my shoulder and handing it to him. "Massive thing," he said. Another sniper also held the gun in his hands and exclaimed, "This thing weighs 15 kilograms. But it can penetrate even tank armor," I put in. "Are you going to destroy tanks?" Another sniper laughed. "No, but with this gun I killed a Polish machine gunner who was hiding behind a sandbag." "Well, everyone has their own quirks," waved his hand at the sniper who called me a good commander. "Have you heard about the French and English?" Another one of my new co-workers asked me. "No. What about the French and English?" I wondered. "Both have declared war on us." "Fucking hell!" I burst out. It became clear to me that the war would not end for me in the Polish campaign, unless, of course, I let myself be killed before the time. With these unhappy thoughts, I soon fell asleep. On September 5th, the Wehrmacht forces were busy regrouping for most of the day. Army Group South, which consisted of 3 full-fledged armies with about 1 million men, needed some more time to fulfill the tasks assigned to it at this stage and seize the cities of Lodz, Ozorkov, Radomsko, and Brzezinski. I was glad of the respite. Immediately after breakfast, I began cleaning my carbine and anti-tank rifle. In doing so, I was pleased that I was able to get not only 7 rounds of ammunition for my carbine in the morning, but also 7 more rounds for my anti-tank gun. This gave me a chance to practice with the rifle. I even tried to attach my old 2.5x scope to it, but I was not successful. About 11 o'clock I was called to the tent that housed the headquarters of our regimental commander, Colonel Holzwarth. When I entered, he was sitting at an oak table and looking at the maps spread out in front of him. "Lieutenant Bauer has arrived on your orders, Mr. Colonel," I reported, and saluted and clicked my heels in the proper manner. "At ease, Ensign," the colonel smiled. "May I see your papers?" I was struck by the cordial expression on his face. He was, after all, an officer of such rank, and I was only a sergeant. I hastily handed the colonel my personal soldier's book. After looking through it, he said, "I see you graduated from the sniper school in Berlin." "That's right, Mr. Colonel," I replied. "Well, some old military men are prejudiced against snipers, but I know the true value of such fighters. That is why in my regiment there are several platoons consisting of only snipers, including your platoon." At that moment, a sergeant with a soot-black face entered the tent. He looked about 40 years old. He saluted the colonel and stood at attention. "At ease, Sergeant Summer," said Colonel Holzwarth. "I have good news for you. I think I have found you a suitable pupil." "Yes, Colonel, that is indeed good news," replied the sergeant. "Look, right in front of you is Gunner Bauer." The colonel smiled. "He already has 30 unconfirmed enemy eliminations to his credit." "Yes, that's really a lot, considering that the war started only a few days ago." Sergeant Summer looked at me with a scrutinizing gaze. Did he already have any prior experience? No, he was drafted 2 years ago and graduated from the sniper school in Berlin, the colonel replied. Well, then he does have talent, the sergeant said. The colonel looked at me and explained, Before you is Sergeant Hans Sommer. He was a sniper in the First World War. He has over 300 confirmed hits to his credit. Although in reality, of course, he's taken out many more than that. Those words shocked me. I was looking at a professional sniper, a professional killer. And after all, I myself had already killed about 30, and probably many more living people, even if they were enemy soldiers. What would I become after I began to learn from this Sergeant Sommer? I was sobered by the thought that it would help me get back in one piece to Ingrid and my little Kurt. Nevertheless, I kept quiet. He's not very talkative, I like that, Sergeant Sommer said to the colonel, still looking at me. But we'll have to see if he really shoots that well. You are right, Sergeant, agreed Colonel Holsworth. I'll put Effley Bauer under your command. You can both go. I left the colonel's tent following Sergeant Sommer. From what distances are you used to shooting? The sergeant asked me on the way to the edge of the camp. From 200 to 400 metres, but a couple of times I've hit from 500, 600 metres. 500, 600 metres? The sergeant interrogated me. Show me your rifle. I put it in his hands. A quick glance at my scope was enough for the sergeant to say, Yes, with that scope it's possible. I'll be glad if you're really such a good shot. When we had moved about 100 paces from the outermost trench, the sergeant ordered me to stay where I was, and himself walked on. At a distance of about 300 metres from me, he stopped, took out of his knapsack a wooden peg about 40 centimetres long, and, sticking it in the ground, attached to it a small piece of paper. I guessed that this would be my target. The sergeant, meanwhile, was moving on. He stuck the next peg into the ground at a distance of 400 metres from me, and the third one at a distance of half a kilometre, if not farther. After that, Sergeant Sommer came back to me, took out his binoculars and ordered, Now show me what you can do. Try to hit all 3 targets as quickly as possible. I lay down on my stomach and set the rifle in position. Aiming my telescopic sight, I pulled the trigger. All right, let's do the next one. I heard Sergeant Sommer's voice as he looked through his binoculars and monitored the results of my shooting. I hurriedly pulled the bolt and a few seconds later shot at the second target. Excellent, I like your rate of fire. Let's go for the last one. I aimed much longer this time, probably 10 or 15 seconds. But then I heard the sergeant's pleased voice after the shot. Nice, right on the bullseye. I didn't expect that from you. For the rest of the day I stayed with Sergeant Sommer. He explained to me all the things that we were not taught in sniper school, but which are so important for the survival of a sniper in combat conditions. This included the intricacies of shooting during sunrise and sunset. At this time of day, a sniper must choose his position so that the sun will blind the enemy, looking in his direction, and not blind himself. Sergeant Sommer also began to teach me the basics of camouflage with the help of improvised means, which turned out to be really much more convenient and reliable than the specific camouflage means we were shown in the school. And where could I get these means in combat conditions? Sergeant Sommer used an ordinary camouflage net. He handed me one and showed me how to attach leaves and branches to it, so that I could blend in with the terrain of the area where I would choose my position. I could not believe that with such simple camouflage I could camouflage myself very well. I mentioned my doubts to the sergeant. He laughed back and told me to turn around, count to 100 slowly, and then try to see him in the shrubbery a couple 100 metres away. When I turned around, I couldn't find Sergeant Sommer in the shrubbery. I even pulled out my binoculars, but that didn't help either. Finally I shouted, I give up! I can't see! Sergeant Sommer lifted himself up, and only then could I see him. He was triumphant. After that he taught me many more useful little things. He explained to me that a bullet travels faster than the sound of a gunshot. So if I took a position far enough away from the target, I could pick a moment when the enemy was not looking in my direction and fire without fear that they would turn around before they saw the flash at the end of my barrel. Sergeant Sommer also told me that night is a great time of day to hunt the enemy. All you have to do is track down some fool who lights a cigarette and shoot at the light. However, in doing so, you have to be more careful than ever and constantly change your position. Don't forget, the flash at the end of your barrel in the dark will be perfectly visible to the enemy. We talked all day until it began to get dark. I tried to memorize every word of the sergeant, feeling that later it could really save my skin. However, he taught me not only how to preserve my own life, but also how to destroy as many enemies as possible. You don't always have to kill an enemy soldier, Sergeant Sommer told me. You can shoot him in the kneecap or wound him in the stomach. The pain will be hellish and he won't be able to hurt you, but one of his comrades will surely rush to his aid. And here you can use the wounded man as bait to get new easy targets. You don't have to wound the enemy yourself. You can just see the wounded man in your scope and wait for someone to crawl up to him. Heavy machine guns and cannons can also be good bait. You've probably noticed more than once that fallen machine gunners are rushed to be replaced by their comrades. The thought of such tricks did not make me happy, but I didn't know yet that this was not the worst of what happens in war. In the evening, Sergeant Sommer began to explain to me how to outsmart the enemy snipers. "Remember," he said, "your most dangerous opponent is the enemy sniper. Never consider him more stupid than yourself, but try to outsmart him." After these words, Sommer showed me how you can put your helmet on an infantry spatula and stick it out of the trench so that the enemy takes it for your head. This way you can fool most snipers. Moreover, you will be able to spot the enemy sniper's position or make sure that there are no snipers hunting for you nearby. However, this trick may not work if your opponent is a very experienced sniper, but that's very rare. Toward the end, Sergeant Sommer began to explain to me how to choose the right position. Ideally, it would be one that I could stay in for as long as I wanted without giving away my presence to the enemy, and one that I could leave at any second without being seen. "If you pick a bad position, you're dead," Sergeant Sommer summed it up. On the way to his tent, he said to me one last time, "In any battle, you must remember rule number 1 above all else." "What is rule number 1?" I asked. "Don't let yourself get killed," he smiled. "Is there a rule number 2? "Yes, it says, 'See rule number 1. We both laughed. Saying goodbye to me at the entrance to his tent, Sergeant Sommer ordered me, "Sergeant Sommer, tomorrow you must report here again. I'll continue to teach you the ropes." "Yes, Sergeant Sommer," I replied. The guys in my new platoon greeted me with surprised questions. They were at a loss to guess where I had spent the day. When I briefly told them about my visit to the colonel and the fact that I had become Sergeant Sommer's apprentice, the envy on the faces of some of them became obvious. "The colonel's favourite." Ironic smiles appeared on the faces of 2 or 3 of them. Josef Enzel, a guy from my platoon with whom we had made some friends yesterday, came up to me. It was at his place that I had left my anti-tank rifle, which of course I had not taken with me when I was summoned to see the colonel. "Don't listen to them," said Joseph. "Every one of them would like to be in your place, so they are jealous of your talent." "Oh yes, I have a very enviable talent." I grinned wickedly. "Let's face it, a talent for killing people. I want only one thing right now, to go home to my bakery." "Well, Gunther, all of us will return to their bakeries or something else, if we survive. Right now, the main thing is to survive. No, the main thing, to conquer the living space for the German people. One of my new co-workers who heard our conversation coined a learned slogan. I was taken aback, but Joseph immediately found himself. Of course, that's the main thing, but if we let our enemies kill us, who will conquer the living space for the Germans? That was a reasonable answer. Neither Joseph nor I wanted any trouble, and that fool could still snitch on us. However, the longer the war went on, the fewer such fools there were. By the middle of the Russian campaign, we were talking freely about everything we thought. At that time, it was already clear to each of us that it was better and safer in prison than at the front. At that time, however, there was no hurry to use repressive measures against us, because in the Wehrmacht, every soldier counted. But I will not go ahead. Soon after the conversation with Joseph, I fell asleep in my trench. I tossed and turned for a long time before sleep finally washed over me. I was uneasy at the thought that tomorrow I would be learning new ways of killing. In my situation, though, they were more like survival techniques. I forced myself to calm down at that thought. The morning right after breakfast, our division was mobilized. Soldiers packed into trucks and armored cars, troop supplies. The offensive continued. Our division was to continue moving towards Warsaw. Having finished loading, I went to Sergeant Summers' tent. He was already waiting for me at the entrance. His face was smeared with soot. I thought at the time that Summer was obsessed with camouflage, but in subsequent battles I've seen how important it is for a sniper to be so obsessed. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said. "We'll see how good it is." He grinned back and looked at the anti-tank gun on my shoulder. "What's that?" "An anti-tank gun." "Yeah, I see you wear it as a talisman. Isn't it a little heavy?" "With its help, I destroyed an enemy machine gunner through a sandbag," I answered, embarrassed. "Okay, that's your business. But don't forget that it is very important for a sniper to be able to leave the position quickly. But you're young, so you probably don't find even this thing a burden." "Yeah, it almost doesn't," I lied, to keep the sergeant from making fun of me. He patted me on the shoulder. "I like your cheerful attitude, Gunther." This time I rode in the back of the truck with Sergeant Summer. The trucks stretched in an endless column. We followed the division, which consisted of tanks and armoured vehicles. When I looked out of the back of the truck on the way, I saw countless lines of Polish refugees. Some of them were carrying bundles of belongings on their backs, but most of them had at least some carts and sometimes even horse-drawn wagons. Very rarely did we see tractors and other vehicles with the refugees. But they had to travel off-road because the road was occupied by our column. This day went quite smoothly for me. On the way, Summer continued to teach me sniper wisdom. For example, he told me, "A running man is also a good target for an experienced sniper. You just have to aim a little ahead of his movements and take into account the distance to the target. Of course, this comes with experience, but I'm sure, Gunther, you'll get the hang of it." I thought about the fact that if I don't get killed, I'll really have plenty of time to master the intricacies of the sniper craft. After Britain and France declared war on us, it was clear that it would be for a long time. The war will probably last another whole year, I decided at the time. Of course, we didn't realize at that time how scary and long it was going to be. In the evening, as usual, we made a halt and camped. We were ordered to dig trenches. We soldiers did not see much need for this, because ahead of us was a whole division of tanks. But an order is an order, and we dug shallow trenches. At the same time, I was surprised to notice that digging trenches had become a habit for me, and was not as tedious as before. In the night, the rumble of artillery guns came from somewhere far away. We woke up, turned over on the other side, and went on sleeping. We did not pay much attention to it, because the fire came from the side of the road to Warsaw, and we were separated by tanks. Besides, we could not believe that they were shooting at our column. After all, the Poles would not dare to fire on a whole division of German tanks, but we were wrong. And soon we saw a flame in the distance, which said that one or more of our tanks had caught fire. Now we could hear the answering rumble of German guns and tank cannons. It was as if sleep had been lifted. Polish shells were falling 100 meters away from us. I quickly pulled on my helmet, which I had carelessly removed from my head before going to sleep. The gunfire did not stop. It had been about half an hour. It might have been less. The time dragged on too slowly. We infantrymen were on the alert, always waiting for the order to attack. Polish shells were exploding closer and closer, and I berated myself for being too lazy to dig a deep trench. However, the main target of the enemy's artillery were tanks, and that was comforting. But a few minutes later, one of the shells fell right into a neighbouring trench. After the deafening explosion, I began to hear the howling of the wounded and shouts of, "Doctor!" Fear gripped me. But a few minutes later, a non-commissioned officer jumped into our trench. "Get ready," he commanded. "In 5 minutes we will go into the attack." His order made me pull myself together. I remembered Sergeant Summers' words that I would not be too comfortable running with an anti-tank gun, and put it at the bottom of the trench. Soon I was already running in the mass of attackers behind our rushing tanks. Shells were exploding relentlessly near us. Every now and then there were screams and groans of the wounded. I forced myself not to think about it, but just to run. The darkness was now and then illuminated by flares hovering on parachutes. At last I could see the forest ahead. It was about 1 kilometre to the edge of the forest. It was from there that the Polish guns were firing at us. At the flash of the next flare, I realized that now we were visible to the Poles as in the palm of my hand. I yelled, "Get down!" and hastily collapsed to the ground. Few people heard my voice over the bursting shells, and the instinct of self-preservation apparently did not work as well for everyone as it did for me. The Poles did not hesitate to open direct fire on our tanks and infantry. Polish machine guns began to crackle, and in a moment the endless screams and groans of the wounded began to echo around me. Our tanks continued to advance towards the forest, returning fire. In between flares I ran cautiously forward, hiding behind every unevenness of the terrain. The Poles had a great many anti-tank artillery pieces, and more of our tanks were burning. About 300 metres from the forest, our tanks stopped for some reason, continuing to fire from cannons and machine guns. In the pre-dawn twilight, I could not understand what had happened. But then, getting closer, in the flash of another flare, I saw an anti-tank ditch blocking the road to the forest. The Polish positions were no more than 400 metres away. I took up a position behind a hill that more or less covered me and began firing with my sniper rifle, aiming at the flashes at the end of the barrels of the Polish machine guns. I don't know how long this went on or how many Poles I killed. Maybe 10, maybe more. The enemy artillery fire had almost died down, but the Polish infantry continued to fire at us. Meanwhile, it was getting light. It became unsafe for me to hide behind the hill. I could see a small barn 150 metres away from me. It might be a good hiding place. I pulled the camouflage net over my face and rushed over there. The barn smelled of hay. Moreover, I saw a few goats and a cow in it. The goats were bleating and the cow wouldn't stop mooing, frightened by the fight. But they were all unharmed. It was like a miracle, and it was a good sign. I decided to take up position in the attic and started climbing the ladder. As I barely poked my head into the attic, I saw a rifle barrel pointed at me. I realized I was finished. But no, I didn't have my whole past life flashing before my eyes. That's what they say, but I didn't have a damn thing like that, just a kind of emptiness and longing. And the shot never went off. It seemed like a long time, but of course it was only a few seconds. And I heard Sergeant Summers' voice. If there had been a Pole here, he would have killed you in no time. I almost fell down the stairs with joy. Summer was lying near the attic window. Through it, as I guessed, he was firing at the Poles, but he remained alert and, hearing my footsteps, immediately pointed his carbine in the direction of the stairs. Looking at me, Summer laughed. "Well, at least your pants are not wet. Well done. How's your ammo?" I went into my ammo bag and handed the sergeant about 20 rounds. "Will you be my gunner?" he asked. "My spotter?" I asked, still in shock. "Yeah, take my binoculars and look for suitable targets." I took Summers' binoculars and stood at the attic window. The sergeant immediately pulled me down. "Keep your head down, Gunther. Do you want us both to be finished?" I realized my mistake. To remain unnoticed, it was necessary to stick out as little as possible. Of course, it was very uncomfortable to watch. But nevertheless, after about a minute, I saw a battery of Polish anti-tank guns. Probably they were 20mm guns. From the attic, they seemed to me literally toy-like. There were 12 of them. There were 2 artillerymen standing near each one. In addition, they had a gunner who was looking through binoculars. "Sergeant, a battery of 20mm guns at 11 o'clock, I said. It was our custom to mark the terrain like a dial to quickly explain the location of an object. Summer immediately pointed his sniper scope there. He had a Zeiss scope, the same or almost the same as mine. "I don't see anything," he said after a second. "A little higher. Over the hill," I explained. That's right," Summer exclaimed. "Look at the gunner." A moment later I saw the Polish artillery gunner collapse with a hole in his head. Then Sergeant Summer started shooting the artillerymen one by one. He pulled the bolt with incredible speed. After that, it took him only a few seconds to load the empty magazine. However, the Poles had by now abandoned the guns and were lying down beside them. They could not be seen over the hill. "It's done," I said. "Wait," Summer objected to me. "Now their sergeant will yell at them to keep firing. That's exactly what happened." Only a couple of minutes passed, and the Poles were again near the guns. Summer opened fire on them. When his magazine ran out again, I saw the Polish sergeant run away from the guns at great speed. He'd killed most of his men, but he'd saved his own skin. "Look for another target," Summer ordered, "but don't lose sight of those guns either. Who knows how stubborn the Poles are?" After that, Sergeant Summer killed several more machine gunners, officers and infantrymen on my tip. He was out of ammunition. I myself had no more than a dozen left. "Stay here," the sergeant told me. "I'll go get ammo. If a good target comes up, you can use what you have left." He smiled. He was gone for about 20 minutes. In that time, I managed to shoot 2 machine gunners and 1 officer. When Sergeant Summer returned with the ammunition, he asked me about my progress and praised me. "I think you'll make a good sniper, Gunther." After that, Summer himself for a while was in the role of my gunner, and I killed 3 more machine gunners, 2 sergeants and an officer in 10 minutes. We did not fire on the ordinary soldiers so as not to draw too much attention to our position. And yet we were noticed. Suddenly I heard Sergeant Summer whispering, "Quiet." When I turned around, I realized something was wrong. The cow and the sheep below were making particularly loud, frightened noises. The sergeant gestured to me to let me know we had company. His face remained calm, and his confidence carried over to me. The rumble of gunfire and explosions had by this time diminished, and we could hear footsteps near the stairs. We heard the sound of Polish speech. Sommer immediately grabbed a grenade and pulled the pin. The explosion was to go off in 4 seconds. Sommer had nerves of steel. He waited about half that time and then tossed the grenade. Thanks to this maneuver, he could be sure that the Poles would not have time to scatter. When the explosion went off, Sommer immediately jumped into the stairwell. I rushed after him. The wooden staircase was shattered by the explosion, and I had to jump too. The grenade killed only one of the enemy, but by the time I jumped down, Sommer had already managed to shoot one of the Poles who had survived the explosion. Another one was wounded and reached for his rifle, but he was immediately relieved by Sergeant Summer's second bullet. The third enemy soldier was pacing toward the doorway. I pointed my rifle at him and yelled, "Freeze!" The Pole froze on the spot. Sommer at the same time shot another fleeing enemy and then turned to me. "Just shoot him." The sergeant's voice was cold and calm. To my surprise, the Pole I had in my sights at the same moment shouted in German, albeit with an accent, "I surrender, don't shoot." He raised his hands, which, after the explosion of the grenade, were as black as his face. Blood was flowing from the Pole's ear. I couldn't pull the trigger. This Pole was the first enemy I had ever seen so close. I said to Sommer, "This one surrenders. I'll take him to the camp." "Do as you please, Sergeant Bauer," replied Sergeant Sommer disappointedly, "but if you get shot by a Polish sniper on the way, blame yourself." Certainly Sommer was thinking prudently. Being an old warrior, he knew from experience that in such cases, a humane attitude toward the enemy can cost you your own life. but I couldn't shoot a soldier who was surrendering. I asked the Pole, "Can you speak German?" "Yes, a little." He was shaking and suddenly began to cry. "Just don't kill me." He looked almost a boy and was no doubt even younger than me. "Shut up," I shouted at him. "I'm taking you prisoner, but if you snot, I'll shoot you." Summer turned to him. "How did you know we were here?" The sergeant asked. "We realized that the fire is coming from somewhere on this side, and then we saw flashes at the end of the rifle barrel." "Well, Gunther, let's get out of here," Summer said to me. The fighting was already quieting down. As soon as we left the barn, Sommer immediately went to look for a new position, and I had to take the Pole to the concentration of our troops. Several of our trucks with ammunition and medical supplies were already a kilometre away from the forest. I ordered the prisoner, "Now you'll rush to the trucks and I'll follow you. If you try to escape, I'll shoot you." We ran. In a minute or two, a bullet whistled 10 paces away from us. The Pole immediately fell to the ground. He was shaking again. Apparently, his nerves had finally given out. I yelled at him, but he did not get up. It was dangerous to stay in the open, so I started to hit the Pole. I realized that if he didn't get up, I would have to shoot him. The prisoner seemed to realize it too. After my first blows, he got up, first on all fours and then to his full height, and we ran again. There was already a crowd of about 100 prisoners of war standing around the trucks. They were guarded by about 10 of our soldiers. Most of the Poles looked as young and frightened as the one I had captured. I quickly reported to the sergeant standing near the trucks that I had brought a prisoner. After that, I immediately hurried back to the woods, but it turned out that the battle was already over. Sergeant Summer met me. He told me that the remnants of the Polish unit retreating through the forest, but there they are pursued by the forces of a fresh division of the Wehrmacht. "Gunther, we deserve a respite." He patted me on the shoulder. "I'm glad you didn't get pierced when you were escorting that prisoner. You'll make a great sniper if you don't do anything stupid." Our infantry division spent the rest of the day regrouping and waiting for reinforcements. The reinforcements didn't arrive until the evening. By the look of most of the new recruits, you could tell that they were clearly untrained fighters. They wore new, freshly pressed uniforms, and their faces were smoothly shaved. Compared to them, I felt like a dirty trench pig. However, I knew that they still had a long way to go, and I watched with triumph the fear and confusion on their faces as they heard the groans of the wounded whom our medics were trying to give some help right in the field. Several other divisions of the Wehrmacht continued to move eastward toward Warsaw, and our division got a little respite to lick its wounds. We received additional ammunition, and after that we received orders to move north. Our goal was the city of Modlin, which the Poles had already managed to turn into a fortress. On September 8th, we spent half a day travelling north to the Vistula River. Further on, we had to stop and wait for the arrival of the engineers. They did not arrive until just before dark. At dawn the next day, we started building pontoon bridges across the river together with the engineers. This took a whole day, and so we were only able to cross the Vistula on September 10th. I was glad for this short respite. During this time, I had time to replenish my ammunition supply a little, and also to listen to another portion of instruction from Sergeant Summer. However, my conversations with him had by this time ceased to be about sniper work alone. From time to time, they turned to worldly topics. Summer was not very talkative when it came to our families, so on such occasions, I was the one who spoke. He listened with interest when I told him about my work in the bakery, about my mother, about Ingrid, about our little son Kurt. Summer himself liked to talk about hunting. He was an experienced hunter, and his favourite game was deer. Summer hunted them in many forests in Germany. At the end of our first conversation on the subject, he said to me, "It was hunting that made me such a skillful sniper. You should definitely try it. Hunting will help your sniper skills a lot." "Yes, hunting is a good thing," I agreed. "But when my tour of duty is over, I won't care about my sniper skills. I'd rather bake bread and cakes for my bakery." There was silence for a few seconds, but then Summer smiled. "Write to me if you need another baker." We both laughed. On September 10th, our 3rd Division, along with another Wehrmacht infantry division, crossed the Vistula. We advanced a little further north and then turned sharply eastward toward Modlin. On the way, we discussed the news that heavy fighting had begun a day earlier in the east of Warsaw. The German army was suffering heavy losses as the Poles had managed to get well entrenched in their capital. I thought anxiously that when storming Modlin, we might also have a hard time. Modlin surpassed even my worst expectations. During the last week, the Poles had managed to surround the entire western part of the city with trenches, anti-tank ditches and barbed wire. Our division had to stop abruptly when we came within rifle-shot distance of Modlin. We were forced to entrench under a hail of bullets and shells. When I was just finishing digging my cell, Sergeant Summer suddenly jumped in. "Come with me, Gunther," he said. "You have not chosen the best place for a sniper position." We ran away from the forward positions of our division. Behind them, Sommer pointed me to a few trees growing nearby. Behind these trees, the sergeant and I dug our new trench. There were already some planks lying there, which Sommer had brought in advance. He laid them on the trench so that there was only a narrow entrance and 2 small slits from which we could fire. "Sandbags should be placed on the boards," said the sergeant, pulling some empty bags out of his knapsack. Since there was no sand nearby, we filled the bags with ordinary earth and laid them on the boards. Summer put camouflage netting on top. Our sniper's nest was ready. Having climbed into the trench, we opened fire on the Poles. There were so many of them that we didn't need a spotter at all. True, the distance to the Polish positions was 500 to 600 metres. Moreover, the enemies were in the trenches. Therefore, not only me, but also Summer did not hit the target with every bullet. However, we had enough ammunition. Summer managed to get some MG-34 machine gun belts. They used exactly the same cartridges as our K98K carbines. The only disadvantage was that we had to take the cartridges out of the belt, but I soon got the hang of it pretty quickly. The siege of Modlin lasted many days. When there was a lull in the fighting, we would talk to Summer. He continued to teach me the finer points of sniping. In particular, he explained to me that under such conditions we could well afford not to worry about changing positions. First, our sniper's nest was far behind the division's forward positions, and the Poles were firing mainly at the leading edge of our troops. Secondly, our trench was quite securely fortified and camouflaged. Of course, it could happen that we run into a sniper or gunner of extra class. Summer grinned unhappily. But that's very unlikely, so it's best not to think about it. He was right. In the entire 2.5 weeks of the siege, the enemy never thought to open fire on our sniper's nest. My sergeant and I managed to kill about 100 Poles each during that time. During the siege, on one of its days, September 17th, the morale of our men was somewhat raised by the news that the Soviet Union had also entered the war against Poland as an ally of Germany. The Poles were doomed in a war with 2 nations, each with vastly superior forces. The forward positions of the defenders of Modlin were constantly being replenished with fresh forces, and our units could not enter the city. The artillery fire did not cease for 2.5 weeks. Finally, on September 28th, Warsaw capitulated. The garrison of Modlin capitulated only the next day. We entered the city. It turned out that the defenders' ammunition was already running low. Moreover, hunger was beginning to break out in Modlin, as all food supply routes had long been cut off by our troops. That was the end of the Polish campaign for me. However, the last Polish units that continued to resist surrendered only on October 5th. After that, Poland was divided into 2 parts. The eastern part was occupied by the Soviet Union and the western part by Germany. During the next 5 months, I was promoted to junior non-commissioned officer, by no means the least of which was my sniper score. Sergeant Sommer confirmed a significant portion of my hits. In addition, during these 5 months, I received one single vacation of 1 week. Ingrid and my mother almost cried when they saw me on the doorstep. Kurt, on the other hand, reacted quite differently. He was frightened of me and didn't want to recognize me as his father. It really upset me. Of course, I reassured myself that children at that age are always wary of unfamiliar people, and because of my army service I had become just such an unfamiliar person to my son. Such reasoning was true and logical, but it was little consolation. Ingrid and my mother kept asking me what the war in Poland had been like. My answers at first were short. Yes, I saw the fighting. No, I don't want to describe it. You see, I'm alive, that's the main thing, and so on. In the end, it became hard for me to see the confusion on their faces. Then I began to lie, to say that the Poles were constantly retreating, almost not daring to fight with us. I even told Mother and Ingrid army anecdotes, a little rough, but funny. It all calmed them down. And soon they believed that the Polish campaign was a kind of adventure, fun and a little risky. Mother and Ingrid wanted to believe it, and it wasn't hard to believe it because all the German newspapers said the same thing. During this vacation, I myself wanted to return to my former cosy world and forget about the army life at least for a week. It didn't happen. Something happened in me. The problems and interests of people living in the civilian life now seemed to me something far-fetched, detached from real life. On the fourth day, I didn't know where to put myself. I even wanted to go back to the barracks, where your whole day is planned and everything is decided for you. It seems that you told Summer in vain that you would be able to bake bread and cakes as well as before, I said to myself, grinning sadly. Nevertheless, I forced myself to try doing it again. What's surprising is that my hands haven't managed to forget how to bake bread. For the last few days of my vacation, I spent several hours a day helping my mother and Ingrid with their work. It helped me to feel again not exactly the same, but at least a little bit like before. I also played with my little boy. By the end of the week, Kurt had gotten used to me and even called me Daddy 2 or 3 times. However, it was time for me to go back to the unit. By this time, our base was already in the Rhineland, which was not far from the French border. Meanwhile, the Second World War continued to heat up. On November 30th, Soviet troops invaded Finland. This led to a 3-month war in which the Soviets suffered heavy losses, but achieved the surrender of Finland. This event roughly coincided with my return from vacation, and shortly thereafter, Summer and I received invitations to transfer to a parachute unit. Parachutists were considered the elite of the German troops. Of all the snipers in our regiment, to become a parachutist was offered only me and Sergeant Summer. However, I hesitated. I did not need unnecessary adventures on my head. I wanted more than anything to return alive to my family. "You still think about it carefully, Gunther," persuaded me Summer. During the Polish campaign, parachutists were ordered only to cut communication lines and railroads. They didn't even have to take part in the fighting. Our skin will be much safer in these troops. After thinking about it, I also decided that the elite troops would not be used as cannon fodder. Besides, if all your co-workers are professional warriors, then each of you has a better chance of survival. So I agreed. Summer and I were sent to parachute school for 6 weeks. There we were issued new uniforms, which in army jargon were called jumpsuits. In addition, we were issued special steel helmets of aerodynamic shape. A jump in an ordinary helmet could end in serious injury for a parachutist. I must say that the use of the German parachute of those years required serious skills from a fighter. At the initial stage, we had a long sports training, during which we practiced the basic techniques and in particular landing. After that, we moved on to studying the material part. We were taught how to stow parachutes. Strangely enough, I mastered it even faster than Summer. Our preliminary training ended with the fact that we made jumps from a model airplane. In addition, in each of us, even in the privates, in every possible way, developed the ability to make decisions independently. It was explained to us at once that a parachutist should be able to act competently even if all his commanders died. Finally, it came to the real jumps. The first jump each of us performed alone from a height of 180 meters. Hearing the order, I had to stand near the fuselage, clamping the end of the extension halyard in my teeth so that my hands remained free. On command, I hooked the carbine to the longitudinal beam. It moved freely along it as I approached the landing hatch. At the hatch, I had to spread my legs wide, grab the handrails on both sides of the hatch with both hands, and throw myself head down. All this had been practiced many times in training, but at the last moment I was afraid. However, as soon as the order to jump was given, my fear instantly vanished, and I jumped. At first I was just falling down, and I was scared again. But that only lasted a few seconds. The retractable halyard unwound to its full length, it was 9 meters, and ripped the parachute bag out of the satchel along with the dome. In the next few moments, the halyard pulled the bag off the parachute dome and it opened completely. I jerked sharply, continuing to fly head down, and in a moment the tension of the parachute slings brought me back to a normal position. It felt almost like a blow, knocking me off my feet. But when I came to my senses, I realized that I was swinging on the slings like on a swing. It's an incredible feeling. You get closer to the ground and feel almost like a bird. However, near the ground you had to focus again. You had to land with a forward lean, making movements with your arms and legs similar to those of a swimmer. This avoided injuries when hitting the ground, because our parachutes were descending at a speed of up to 6 meters per second. As a result, many of us were bruised on our first jump, but later we appreciated the high speed of the German parachutes when we had to jump under enemy fire. I should also note that although the German method of parachute opening forced us to jump upside down, unlike the British or Russians, we could afford to jump from much lower altitudes, and this was especially useful for us in Crete, when because of the enemy air defence fire we jumped from a height of only 70–80 meters. However, our parachutes had some disadvantages. For example, when jumping, we could not regulate the rate of descent and the place of fall. Moreover, we had to jump with only one parabellum, and all other equipment was dropped separately in special containers, otherwise it could tangle the slings. Consequently, these containers had to be found and unpacked later, often under enemy fire. However, during the first jump, I did not think about it. I was much more focused on extinguishing the dome and freeing myself from the parachute straps. This was quite hard, considering that the slings were behind my back. As a result, the first time, the parachute dragged me on the ground for several meters before I was able to take control of the situation. However, I subsequently learned to handle it much more easily. Subsequent jumps were done in groups, and each time we lowered the altitude. The last training jump was performed by the whole platoon, and from a height of only about 100 meters. After that, we finally became officially called parachutists. In April 1940, the German army entered Denmark and Norway. There was practically no fighting there, and so our division was not involved in either of these two operations. I continued to learn more and more of the wisdoms of soldiering. Among other things, I learned how to plant mines, what signs can be used to spot an enemy mine, and even how to defuse some types of mines. In addition, we were explained the vulnerabilities of tanks and taught how to use a variety of weapons. By this time, the Wehrmacht had just received a lot of new weapons, both from the German industry and from the Austrian, Czech and Polish arsenals. With the new small arms, we mastered the intricacies of close combat and fired mostly MP-38 submachine guns rather than rifles. However, Sergeant Summer continued to teach me the secrets of sniping. Despite the age difference, he and I became very good friends. On April 9th, Sommer and I were informed that we were included in a special group of parachutists, the Coke Assault Battalion, named after its commander, Hauptmann Koch. This surprised me, as we could still to some extent be called novices in parachuting, although of course I felt a certain pride. But Sommer quickly cooled my ardour. "Don't get conceited," he told me. "You don't know where we'll be thrown." These words did not frighten me, but made me to treat everything with restraint, not overestimating my strength. And in the evening before leaving for a new unit, suddenly out of the blue, I was seized with longing. Germany was still at war with France and Great Britain. Who knows, maybe I'll be sent to France. That's where my father had died. I had to do everything I could to avoid repeating his fate. I was very afraid that my son, like me, would grow up without a father. In the assault battalion of parachutists, our sniper skills immediately interested Oberleutnant Rudolf Witzig. He familiarized himself with our personnel files and summoned us to his office. His first question was, "Are you ready to die for the Führer?" What could Sommer and I answer? A negative answer for each of us threatened fatal consequences, and we both answered almost unanimously that it would be an honor for us to die for the Führer. After that, Oberleutnant Witzig asked us a few more questions about our military skills, and at the end of the conversation told us that we were enrolled in the secret group Granite, of which he was the commander. That same day we were taken to a training camp near Dessau, where the main part of the Granite group had been preparing for the assault on Fort Eben Emael for several months. However, we only learned about what we were about to face when we arrived at the site. Why was such strict secrecy necessary, and what was this legendary fort? I'll tell you in a few words. Eben Emael was part of the system of fortifications between Maastricht and Liège, the power of which in the territory south of the area was so great that the Belgians and the Allies even doubted that the Germans would dare to launch an attack in this area. The dimensions of the fort were 800 by 900 meters. In its underground part there were ammunition and food stores, a power station, a telephone communications center and barracks. In addition, Eben Emael was surrounded by an anti-tank ditch. The fort's armament included numerous guns of 120 and 75 mm caliber, as well as anti-tank guns, mortars, and large-caliber machine guns. Their total firepower was so significant that capturing the bastion in a frontal attack was probably impossible in those days. An attack by artillery and bombers also seemed doomed to failure because of the considerable thickness of the fort's concrete walls. And an effective airborne assault using traditional vehicles was not possible due to the relatively small size of the bastion. However, the capture of Fort Eben Emael made possible the advance of German troops through Belgium to the heart of France, and our command was able to develop a bold, risky, and beautiful operation, the success of which depended primarily on the factor of surprise. That is why it was necessary and strict secrecy, which we sometimes reach at absurdity. Thus, members of the group had no right to disclose even their own names to outsiders. However, we did not have much opportunity to do so. The training camp was almost completely cut off from the outside world. No one from the group received vacations, and our letters were severely censored. I was forced to write to Ingrid and my mother to tell them that I was still serving in my old position and to limit myself to general phrases about how well I was doing. Of course, each of us tried to comply strictly with such requirements, but nevertheless, even before we joined the group, 2 of its members had been sentenced to death for failure to observe secrecy. I don't know the details of this story, it was not publicized in the group, but it was me and Sommer who were taken instead of these 2. Combat training took up all our time. It was especially hard for us, 2 newcomers, who had joined the group less than a month before the start of the operation. Each member of the group had to be able to fill in for any member of the group. Sommer and I even had to learn some sapper skills. Why this was necessary, I will say a little further on. A large part of the training also consisted of us practicing our actions on a life-sized mock-up of Fort Eben Emael. After training, we barely had the strength to walk to bed in the evenings. And who here said that in the elite troops we would have an easier time? I half-jokingly asked Sergeant Sommer. I must say that he was extremely exhausted these days. Probably it was his age, and despite his experience, he had a harder time with physical exertion than I did. It's better to sweat in training than to be a cold corpse on the battlefield. He parried. His sense of humour was still intact, and that gave me confidence. But back to the way we were going to take Eben Emael. The weak point of the fort was that its air defence was provided by only 8 anti-aircraft machine guns. It was a sin not to take advantage of that. And since, as I have already mentioned, landing by traditional vehicles was impossible, our command solved the problem by proposing to use the latest DFS-230 assault gliders. Of course, there was one more problem: 25-centimetre armour of the fort's defences. However, our sappers found that it could be easily burned through with 50-kilogram shaped charges. Their power was multiplied by the fact that the explosion was directional. This was achieved by using a cone-shaped sleeve of thin iron on one side of the charge, or by giving a certain shape to the charge itself with a cone-shaped indentation in the appropriate place. Thus, these charges could penetrate powerful armour and reinforced concrete walls at relatively light weight. Each of us had to know how to use shaped charges. For this, we needed sapper training. On May 10th, 1940, at night, at 3:15, from our base near Cologne, 11 Junkers 52 planes took to the air, each towing a DFS-230 transport glider. On board the gliders was our assault group Granite, led by Oberleutnant Witzig. There were only 85 of us, while the fort garrison had over 1,200 soldiers. Each of us was armed with a parabellum pistol and grenades. In addition, each had with him a weapon that corresponded to his specialization. True, Summer and I, in addition to our K98K carbines with Zeiss telescopic sights, also had submachine guns. Other guys in the group were armed with MG-34 machine guns, MP-38 submachine guns, and Polish Ur anti-tank rifles. In addition, 4 fighters in our group were armed with Flammenwerfer 40 flamethrowers. And of course, we had with us shaped charges weighing 12.5 and 50 kilograms each. The 50-kilogram charges consisted of 2 halves, each with carrying handles, and they had to be connected before detonation. On the way, the tow rope of one of the gliders broke, another glider unhooked early. Both of these gliders landed on German territory. The rest of our gliders flew safely to Aachen, a German city located in the place where 3 countries converge: Germany, Belgium, and Holland. In a matter of minutes, we were to land on the roof of Fort Eben-Emael. During these minutes, I was as focused as possible and tried not to think about anything but the upcoming mission. Before the flight, I took a long look at the pictures of my wife and son in my medallion, and Sergeant Summer patted me on the shoulder and said, "Don't forget rule number 1. His words made me pull myself together, and now I was flying into the unknown. The upcoming assault was extremely risky, but I forced myself not to think about it. Below me, the dark night land floated below me. About 20 kilometers from Eben-Emael, tow cables of our gliders were detached from the Junkers, and we flew silently to the target. When our glider flew up to the roof of the fort, I expected the Belgians to open fire on us from anti-aircraft machine guns. But it happened only when our glider had already managed to land on the roof with a crash. As I learned after a while, all 9 of our remaining gliders had successfully landed on the fort. It is true that our group commander Witzig, ironically, was in one of the 2 gliders, which detached from the Junkers, still over German territory. But instead of him, Oberfeldwebel Wenzel immediately took command of the group, and we immediately began the attack. Our glider landed about 15 meters from the intended target. The bombers, who were flying with me, immediately grabbed shaped charges in their hands and rushed to the artillery tower of the fort, which was opposite us. Their advance was covered by the fire of a turret machine gun mounted on the roof of our glider. Summer and I immediately took up positions and began firing at the Belgians, who were firing at us with machine guns and rifles through embrasures in the roof of the fort. In the darkness, the flashes at the end of their barrels were clearly visible, and we had no difficulty in aiming and pulling the trigger, aiming again and pulling again. In the meantime, our bombers were burning through the armour of the armoured turrets with shaped charges, throwing charges into the gun muzzles and ventilation shafts. All this lasted only minutes. I acted as if in a dream, automatically finding the target and pulling the trigger. Finally, I stopped seeing flashes at the ends of the enemy's barrels. From the somnambulistic state in which I had been all this time, I was brought out of it by Sommer's voice. "We've broken in. Let's go." I rushed after him. Soon we were inside the smoke-filled corridor. About 2 floors below, the sounds of battle could be heard. The rifle was useless here, so I slung it on my shoulder and picked up the MP-38 submachine gun that had been hanging around my neck. Sergeant Sommer did the same before I did. We began to hurriedly descend the stairs. When we entered the room where the battle was going on, we both shouted at the same time, "Friendlies!" so we wouldn't get shot by the guys from our own team, thinking we were enemies. The Belgians were shooting back, fortified in the next room. Suddenly I saw a grenade flying at us, and what happened next was something you only see in movies. I would never have believed that such a thing could really happen if I had not seen it with my own eyes. One of our parachutists swung his submachine gun and kicked the grenade toward the Belgians like a tennis ball. A second later, there was an explosion. Ours took advantage of the enemy's confusion and threw several more grenades at the Belgians. A few seconds later, we burst into their premises, without ceasing to fire from submachine guns. The defenders of the fort were retreating. One of them killed our parachutist by shooting him in the chest with his rifle. The distance was only a few paces, and it was not hard to hit here. In response, I immediately cut off the Belgian with a short burst. We continued to advance. When we opened another door, we found ourselves in an open space. Directly in front of us was a concrete pillbox with a machine gun nest. The Belgian machine gunners immediately opened fire on us. However, we immediately took positions inaccessible to their fire, and none of us was even wounded. The bullets ricocheted very close to us. From the other ends of the fort there were also relentless lines, explosions and shouts. It seemed that the whole of Ebenemael had become a war zone by this point. The air smelled of burning. There was smoke, and it was hard to see anything more than 10 meters away. I pulled out my sniper rifle. Sommer did the same. Firing almost simultaneously, we killed 2 machine gunners at once. Other guys from our group immediately took advantage of the fact that the machine gun fire had stopped and threw a couple of grenades in the direction of the pillbox. One of them exploded very close to the firing slot. But 2 other parachutists decided to throw grenades inside the pillbox just in case. They shouted to Sommer and me, "Cover me!" and rushed towards the pillbox. We put our sights exactly on the firing slot. Soon the paratroopers' grenades flew in. There was a big explosion. Now we could be sure that the pillbox was neutralized. However, immediately behind the pillbox was another of the fort's structures. In its steel door was a small firing gap through which the Belgians were firing at us with rifles. Almost without aiming, I fired there. I must have hit one of the enemy, and the fire died down for a second. That was enough for our flamethrower to run up to the door. A jet of fire burst from his barrel, and we heard the shouts and howls of the Belgians. Black smoke billowed from the gap. Another parachutist immediately placed a 12.5 kilogram shaped charge on the door. We all bounced back to our shelters. There was an explosion. Immediately, without wasting a second, we all rushed inside the structure. The corridor was filled with dead and dying Belgian soldiers. Some of them continued to howl and moan quietly. Just in case, we finished them off with bursts from our submachine guns. The corridor ended with another steel door with an observation slit, but no one tried to fire at us from it. When I jumped to the door, I saw the fleeing enemies and immediately opened fire at them with my MP-38 right through the slit, firing at chest level. They started to fall with screams. To my surprise, it turned out that they were running away in such a panic that they hadn't even locked the door. It was quickly swung open by the same parachutist who had previously beaten off a Belgian grenade with his submachine gun like a tennis racket. He threw the grenade inside and immediately slammed the door shut. I bounced around the corner. There was an explosion. After that, we rushed forward. Soon we were back in the narrow corridor going downhill. There we came upon 2 Belgians waiting for us around the corner, but our bullets beat them. Well, I was beginning to like my MP-38. It was a great weapon for close combat in situations like this. On the next floor, we joined another group of parachutists who were breaking through to the next room, but they were hampered by heavy fire from the Belgians. There were still enough grenades left in our small group, so we threw grenades at the Belgians. After that, we rushed in. Some of the enemy fled, the rest we quickly destroyed in a short fight, after which only one of our guys was wounded. Many of us allowed ourselves to relax for a few seconds afterward. It nearly cost the life of a parachutist who kicked a grenade like a tennis ball. I suddenly saw one of the Belgians, who appeared to have been killed, suddenly point his gun at him. However, my turn rang out before he pulled the trigger. "Thank you," the parachutist I had saved his life said to me. His face paled for a moment. He must have thought he might have just died. A moment later we all ran on, continuing to storm the fort. What were the results of our actions by this point? Only in the first 15 minutes of the battle the Granite Group managed to destroy 7 casemates and 14 guns. When our dive bombers flew to the fort 25 minutes after the start of the attack, they saw German flags over most of the targets, indicating that these objects had already been taken. As a result, the bombers were able to concentrate their attack on the casemates, which covered the anti-tank moat with fire. The only point of the operation, which we could not perform immediately, is the destruction of the turret with 122mm guns. The thing is that the group responsible for this was in one of the gliders that did not reach the fort. Accordingly, we had the task to disable the turret with our own forces. However, by that time we had already run out of 50-kilogram shaped charges. But anyway, in just an hour, we managed to destroy most of the fort's guns, and a substantial part of its territory came under our control. Around 8 in the morning, a glider arrived with Oberleutnant Witzig, who immediately took command of our group. And soon we received new ammunition and were finally able to disarm the turret with 122mm guns. Ammunition, including charges, was dropped to us in parachute containers by He-111 bombers. However, it should be said that we did not destroy all the 75mm guns of the garrison. Destruction of some of them was not our priority, and they began to shell the fort with buckshot. Accordingly, the collection of parachute containers was very dangerous, and we already had dead and wounded. Every man counted. Several of the parachutists volunteered at once, but the commander decided to entrust the collection of containers to the Belgians, whom we had already managed to capture. When they were collecting the containers, we kept them in our sights at all times. However, none of them tried to escape. We hoped that the fort's garrison would not fire on our own. However, just before my eyes, 2 Belgians were wounded by buckshot.